Welcome to the video. In this video we're going to talk about the 4 lessons that I use with people to help them transition from line of sight flying into FPV or first person view, where we're looking out of a camera connected to the front of the craft that's usually transmitting videos to a ground station or to a set of goggles. These 4 lessons assume that you will have already completed the first set of 10 lessons so that you can fly the craft safely in all orientations, but also hover it in all orientations too, so that if something goes wrong as part of an FPV flight, you can still bring the craft in and land it at your feet without putting anyone in danger. There was also a second video that was done last June which talked about looking into FPV and what you needed to consider. Some of the parts that we're going to talk about in this video were covered in that original one back in June, so if you have watched that one you might have a little bit of deja vu. But we'll break it down into 4 lessons and we'll cover those in this video after we've talked about a couple of common sense things at the beginning. As well as watching those videos, a couple of other things that you'll need to think about when you move into FPV. You also need to consider the craft that you want to try. A lot of the new subscribers obviously want to fly with multi-rotors, but there are people who want to try it on a plane or a wing. That's absolutely fine. Just be aware that when you're trying it with a plane or a wing, you're going to need even more space to try it because you can't hover it like you can with a multi-rotor. You've got to keep that forward momentum up and nice banking turns, so you need that extra bit of room. You do need to make sure that whatever craft you are trying to fly with flies perfectly line of sight and is trimmed beautifully too. There's no point trying to FPV on a craft that won't fly straight and level when you have your hands off the sticks. Make sure that yours does before trying FPV on it. Consider camera selection. There's lots of different cameras out there. Lots of people go for GoPro when they're trying to impress everybody. There's also the Mobius, there's 808 keychain cams. I would recommend go for a little 600 TVL CMOS camera with a 120-degree lens because of a couple of reasons really. One, they're much cheaper than things like the Mobius or the GoPros, and it's less painful to break one than it is a 300 or 350 pound GoPro camera. And secondly, they have a much lower latency, so the image appears much quicker in the goggles, and that gives a more connected feel, which makes it easier to learn, particularly when you're starting. Always take a spotter with you when you're learning to fly FPV, and then once you've got the hang of it, still have a spotter with you. It's common sense, safety, and also a lot of the governing bodies recommend that you can't FPV without a spotter by your side. When you're learning, the spotter with RC experience is invaluable to help you take into account the things that you'll lose by looking out the camera, which is predominantly your situational awareness and also feeling when the craft is sinking or rising or drifting to side. Always make sure that you've got a self-level that works perfectly, and ideally a GPS return to home mode on the craft as well. If you're going to try it with a plane or a wing, install something like a NAS-A32, an APM, or one of those boards that has that return to home functionality, so that if you get into real trouble, you can flick the oh dear switch and have the craft fly back towards you and rescue itself. Expect problems, you will get them. An FPV equipped platform has more electronics, more wires, more bits and pieces that can go wrong. I've had my FPV equipment fail on me a couple of times despite all of the checks that we're going to go through in these videos. Sometimes a soldering connection will break in the middle of a flight and you'll lose your video, and then it's up to you using your line of sight skills to get that craft back, or flicking the switch for the GPS return to home. My last tip is start with goggles you can afford. Keep it simple and build as you get more into FPV. I've had a couple of people that have tried FPV that couldn't get on with it, who have found the looking out of the goggles or the screen, it tends to be worse with goggles, while flying makes it very disorientating and actually gives them a bit of a headache or makes them feel dizzy. So don't go mad and spend thousands of pounds on FPV equipment. Keep it simple, get into the hobby, make sure you like it. Once you like it, then work up. If you have a buddy that already flies FPV that you can try it out on, who is willing to give you a go on the sticks, then that's a great way to start and figure out that it works for you. A couple of things that you need to do before you start to fly FPV. A couple of slides here before we get into the lessons. First one is obviously make sure you got loads of space. You need as much room as is possible while you're learning. You don't want to be worrying about smashing into trees, the size of barns or buildings. You want as much room as you can get. Expect it to feel odd. It will feel weird. When I first started to FPV, the idea of looking out the camera just felt so odd, and putting on the goggles for the first couple of times and seeing the bottom half of the screen full of grass and daisies and the top half of the screen full of sky just made me feel a bit sick before I pumped the throttle. It is an alien experience. Some people take to it faster than others. Once you've got the hang of it, it's great, but it will feel odd, so don't worry if it does. It happens to most of us. When you get to the flying field every time, fly the model normally, make sure everything works, make sure that it's responding properly, the self-level and return to home are all tickety-boo, and then if you get into trouble, you know you can rescue it. It's amazing what happens to these models even though they're not touched. Bouncing around in the boot of a car, things will come loose, or potentially things like soldering joints will have a problem. And every time you fly, test the range of the FPV kit in the area you're in. Ideally, get your spotter to wander off to the other side of the field with the camera powered up. Have the goggles or screen in front of you. Make sure that as they move around that you're not getting any wacky interference and there's nothing going on around you that will stop it from working. Place the model well in front of you when you start to fly. It's tempting to only put it 6 to 10 feet in front of you, which is what you'd normally do when you're flying line of sight to take off your multicopter, but when you first start there is a danger that it will drift backwards or to the side as you're lifting off, and you don't want that to be drifting into and hitting you or your spotter. Sometimes using a chair can be a good idea. One of those kind of camping chairs is ideal. It's something you can sling over your back and allow you to sit down, because if you do get dizzy then you're sat down already. You don't have to try and contend with flying a craft, as well as feeling a little bit unwell because of that motion sickness that some people get when they try FPV. And finally, of course, the golden rule is be aware of other people, pets and their property. Don't do this near anybody, and this is another reason why having the spotter with you is really important. Not only can they help and call out when you're sinking or rising or getting too close to an obstacle, they can also let you know if somebody has walked on the field with a dog, so you can quickly bring the craft back in without it causing a problem. I've had to do that once or twice because dogs seem to love to chase a multicopter. They think it's the most fun thing in the world. They wouldn't if they caught it. So now that we've covered all that, let's talk about the 6 things that we're going to cover as part of the 4 lessons. We're going to talk about getting familiar when comfortable with takeoff, flying lines, i.e. backwards and forwards, flying boxes, getting that level of comfort so that we're completely happy, making sure that we are getting a sense for height control, and finally using things like on-screen displays. It's very tempting to turn all the technology on at the beginning, and that can be very distracting and disorientating. You need, I would suggest, to do that towards the end of the 4 lessons. Just means that then you're watching the flying, not watching how cool the on-screen display looks. Lesson 1 is quite basic. What we're going to do here is put the quad in front of you, 20 or 30 feet in front. You're going to then walk back to the start line. Then you're going to put your goggles on or watch the screen, arm the copter. Then you're going to lift off as quickly as you can. Get to, I would suggest, about treetop height is nice. Make sure you've got self-level engaged if you have self-level on the craft. Make sure if you have a barometer function where it will manage height automatically, you've also got that turned on as well. When you first start out, you want all the training wheels and aids that you can possibly get your hands on turned on to help you with this. As soon as you have lifted off, what you need to do then is to tilt the nose down slightly, fly forward, and then once you have got a little bit of way down the field, get the spotter to let you know that you're at the predetermined place that you've agreed with him or her, then turn the craft around and fly back to where you took off from, and just practice doing that up and down motion in a line. Don't try and do anything more than that, and the spotter's job is to tell you whether or not you're wandering left or right, or whether or not you're sinking or rising, because in line of sight flying you will naturally take into account if as part of a banking turn you increase in height, you'll bleed off that height by reducing the throttle as you come back down. You won't necessarily feel that in lesson 1, but don't worry about it. Just listen to your spotter, take that into account, reduce or increase the throttle, use small movements, and keep repeating lesson 1 until it feels very natural and it's something you can do without having a problem. The key for this is to make it so that you don't have that trepidation when you pump the throttle and take off, but also you can transition into fast forward flight and out of fast forward flight without incident. Once you've got lesson 1 sorted, lesson 2 is a little bit more. So it's everything that lesson 1 has, but now we're going to look at flying in boxes and getting that level of comfort flying at boxes increased. So this time we're going to take off and fly a square slowly, slowing down and turning each of the corners, again using clockwise and anti-clockwise direction. So it's very similar to some of the lessons that we previously discussed in the line of sight 10-step program. This time, however, we're going to do it by looking through the camera. I find doing this on something like a football field or a rugby field that's just had its lines redone, so they're nice, bright and white, is fantastic because you can use that as a very clear indicator down your FPV camera to fly around the outside. Just make sure that you're nice and high so that you don't clip one of the goalposts. Again, try and keep it about the height of the trees in the park. Make sure that the spotter is helping you maintain that height. You don't want to get too high because then it starts to get more tricky with orientation and controlling it. You want to be focusing on following that white line or the markers that you've all agreed around the outside of the field that you're flying around. This is where you're getting used to the view from the camera and starting to estimate the height, particularly when you're starting to come lower to the ground. When you are moving along the longer legs, it's easy to start sinking down, and you can start to work with your spotter to make sure that you are feeling whether or not you are sinking or rising. You'll start to get a feeling for it as well with the amount of throttle it needs to maintain the height, depending on how far you've got it pushed over. Now, normally that's something that you pick up when you're flying line of sight by actually seeing it drop 6 inches. You need to be able to start to feel that. And it might take a while of flying like this with your spotter for you to start compensating for that. If you have a barometer function, that will really help you because the craft will maintain its height as you move through it. And this step then really is just about getting that level of comfort up. If you want to really try, you can try landing with the camera during lesson 2. Personally, I never land with the camera. I always flip my goggles up and land line of sight. It just feels more natural to me, and I can have a much more controlled landing with line of sight than I can with the goggles. But if you want to try with the goggles, then you can try it in lesson 2. Once you've got the hang of that and you're kind of managing to fly around in boxes, and again, fly clockwise and anti-clockwise, next one, lesson 3, is the last 2 pieces. It should start to feel a lot more natural now, and the temptation is to take off all the training wheels and just go for it. My advice would be hang on, we're almost there. You've got the basics. If you have an on-screen display, then lesson 3 is where I ask students to turn it on and practice flying with it in the field of view. A lot of the on-screen displays can tend to be very cluttered, and they can actually be a distraction and stop you from flying effectively. I fly now with a lot less on the screen than I did when I first started using on-screen displays, because I tended to find myself looking around the on-screen display information rather than looking out the front of the craft and concentrating on flying safely. Practice flying with the barometer function turned on and off. Make sure that you can handle the height. If you can't handle it effectively, or that's something you're really struggling with, that's fine. Use the barometer function yourself to maintain that. There's no disgrace in using barometer to maintain the height. It'll probably do a better job in FPV flying than you would anyway. Also, practice turning the self-level function off, or if you're using auto level, trying horizon mode, which allows you to be more aggressive at the edges of the stick movement. Try it in this stage. If you don't like it, it doesn't matter. Go back and turn it back into self-level, turn barometer back on, explore the limits of what you feel comfortable with as you get more and more used to it, and also different crafts feel differently with the different modes as well. You just need to feel what feels right for you. And here you need to fly it until you can maintain height automatically through all the turns and maneuvers with all the technology on your on-screen display, and you're not getting into trouble. So now we're nearly there. Lesson 4 is now we can start to push it. So up until now we've been flying in a field. Now we can try and push it towards the edge of line of sight as we're allowed to by the legislation and guides that we have in the hobby. We can also start practicing recording the flight. I wouldn't recommend until this point worrying about what video you're capturing, because in my experience the pilot starts to think about how good the video is going to look when they finish with it and isn't thinking about the flight. So the thing that we're going to think about here is putting an 808 or a Mobius or even a GoPro camera on in addition to the camera that we're using to fly, and recording the flight and having a go at practicing that to make sure that it works every time. When you start using this technology, it's very easy to forget to hit the record button. Done it loads myself, and get into the habit of doing that. There is technology that will allow you to fly multiple kilometers away from where you start out. In a lot of places that is actually very naughty, if not illegal, and you are not only breaking the law, but you're also putting people at risk as well. And that brings me on to the last question, which is don't fly in populated areas or too close to anybody. These things fail, and occasionally you'll have a flyaway. If it feels like it's going to fly away, then make sure that you are getting the craft back, or if the craft starts to misbehave or act oddly, then bring it back to you as quickly as you can and get it landed. So by the time we finish these 4 lessons, then FPV should be something that's very comfortable for you, and it's something you're starting to enjoy, and starting to have things like ride-alongs and showing your friends and family how cool it actually is. Last thing to keep in mind then is a couple of top tips, and these are covered in lots of other videos, but we'll talk about them here. Winter versus summer flying. FPV is different in the winter to summer. You'd expect it to be. The weather's different, but it's different for different reasons. Obviously, winter, you're going to get bloody cold stood at the side of a field, so that's fine. Expect to wrap up warm and have a hot drink with you. But it does mean that goggles can be difficult to use in winter because the moisture off your eyes tends to settle out and fog up the lenses of the goggles. That's happened to me in one of my early experiences flying in winter, and it made life very exciting. You will get shorter flight times. Lipos don't work as effectively in the cold, so you need to make sure that if you normally get 10 minutes out of your FPV craft, you're only expecting to get 9, maybe even 8. The sun will be lower in the sky in winter, an awful lot lower. So expect that when you turn around and you're facing towards the sun, that the sky will start to be exposed properly, but it will mean that the ground is completely underexposed. So be aware of that. Make sure that when you're flying, that you're not going to be flying back to you on the last leg with the sun behind you, because that makes it very difficult. Summer is fantastic for FPV flying. You get some beautiful views. The screens on ground stations can be washed out, so goggles is actually sometimes a better choice for summer. Just make sure that you're not hot and sweaty, because they'll still steam up. You will get slightly longer flight times because the LiPo batteries will behave better in the warm weather, but there is going to be more people about, so the chance of that person wandering onto the field with a dog in the middle of your FPV flight is a lot more in summer than it is in winter. Battery and timer alarms. Set them, use them. Make sure that they start automatically so that as soon as you start your flight, you have a warning. It's great if you have a radio transmitter that also has some voice alarm function. Things like some of the Spectrum DX9, DX18, the Taranis, some of the others have the voice feature. Make sure that you've turned that on, so not only will it announce the mode that you're in and tell you where the switches are, it will also count down and keep you up to date with how much battery time you have left. You don't want to run out of battery when it's right at the other side of the field. Orientation tips. Have the spotter call out direction for the first few times. Make sure that you have a spotter with you who actually knows a little bit about RC. I've had my spotter with me a couple of times who has been less experienced in RC, and that has caused some of the feedback that I've been getting from the spotter on how my flight's going to be a little less clear, and you don't want that when you're flying FPV. And finally, comply with those local laws and requirements. Make sure you're clear about what the ceiling is, i.e. how high you are allowed to go. Make sure you're clear about how far away you're allowed to go, and also make sure that you are not putting anyone in unnecessary danger. So hopefully for those of you that are interested, that explains my approach to teaching FPV. So those are the 4 lessons that we tend to go through. Each of those lessons might take a number of flights to get down pat, and what I would recommend is that you don't go on to the next lesson until the one you're currently on you feel completely comfortable with. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and as always, very happy flying.